Well, hello everyone, welcome back to another video. I'm filming this on Sunday and it's a pretty dreary Sunday. I've just got back from the Lake District where I've been for the last couple of days. It wasn't a dedicated photography trip, but I did go to some really beautiful locations, as you would expect from such a beautiful part of the UK. And I haven't spent an awful lot of time in the Lake District, so this trip was mainly one to go and sort of scout out a lot of the kind of popular places, I suppose. And there is great debate within landscape photography as to whether you should focus on those kind of honeypot locations or try and find something a bit more original. So what I thought I'd do today is bring you guys along, show you some of these really beautiful and iconic locations. I didn't do any filming in the field, but I did manage to capture some B-roll. So we'll hop into Lightroom. I'll talk you through some of the photos, and I want to give just a few pointers to any beginner and maybe intermediate photographers, or any photographers really, just to give you some pointers about how you can approach photographing these iconic locations whilst still being able to explore some creativity and come away with some photos that are maybe slightly more unique. So I was going to do this video chronologically in terms of the photos, but I don't think that matters too much. So I'm going to start with one of my favourite photos from this particular trip. So we were staying in a campsite in Kase. Kase is a town that's fairly central in the Lake District. It's on the shores of Derwent water, which is a really beautiful lake, and there's tons of great places of interest around that area. So the first location was the Ashness Bridge. A really quaint little bridge. You know, it's really old, it's very small, but it's situated in an area that's very beautiful. You have some fells around it, you have views over to Derwent water, you've got the river and the cascades that lead through the bridge, and you have some lovely trees and woodlands surrounding that area. And typically photos of this have the bridge as the sort of main subject, but for me personally, I wanted to have the bridge as part of the frame because it is a beautiful subject, but I wanted to have a bit more of a supporting role in my photo. Now, one of my favourite things about this trip, which was done last week, so we're right at the start of September, but it just felt like autumn was in the air. It was really cold. I was wearing at least 3 layers and a pair of gloves, so I haven't done that since about March this year. So it definitely felt like the season was changing, and I could see that there were just certain signs that autumn was just around the corner. It's my favourite season to photograph in, and you know, for me, whenever I see that, it's just really encouraging. It just fills me with enthusiasm to shoot. And along the shore of the river leading down to the Ashness Bridge, there was this beautiful silver birch tree which was just showing signs of that lovely autumn foliage. There was just these little jewels of orange leaves that were sort of dappled across the tree, and they were falling into the river. And I wanted that to kind of be the main subject. I felt like it was slightly more unique than just focusing on the bridge. And whilst the bridge is still in the frame, and it's definitely a photo, you know, of the Ashness Bridge area, it was just something that was a little bit more complex, I suppose. It was something that was less obvious. It was showing the scene and the area as a whole. Even in this photo, you've got the distant fells and Derwent water in the sort of very far background. You've got the bridge, you've got the river, and you have the tree. And I think that's something that it's really important when you're in these very popular locations. Just choosing how you frame your composition can definitely change what the focal point is and sort of what the eye is drawn to. You know, having a photo of just the bridge and the river is great, but there's so much more around that you can explore, and that's definitely something that I found in this location. Now, another great example of this is a location I visited a couple of days earlier, and that was Blea, Tarn and the Langdale Pikes. This was sort of further down south in the Lake District, nearer to Ambleside. It's very much a remote area of the national park. It was a bit of a fun drive in the camper van getting there with the sort of narrow, twisty lanes. But this is a landscape photography location that has a ton of potential, and most people just photograph the actual lake itself, and I'll show you some of the kind of iconic compositions from here. But in terms of the geography of this particular location, there's just so much here to photograph. Now, on this particular day, we had pretty much all 4 seasons within a couple of hours. It was sunny, it was cloudy, then there was just torrential rain, and then there were very heavy gusts of wind, and it made for quite a dynamic and very challenging shooting experience, which can be frustrating sometimes, but it can also be very rewarding. So this lake itself is fairly small, but there's a ton of great subjects around that. There's a lovely path that leads down the sort of left-hand side of the lake as you're looking towards the Langdale Pikes in the background. There's some lovely old pine trees. And I guess the iconic shot is more of the sort of lake shore where you have this old fence that sort of leads into the lake and sort of points towards the Langdale Pikes. So visiting this location, I had to get that iconic shot. And I'll put this raw file up on screen to show you how challenging it was to shoot in these conditions. I wanted to try and get some long exposures because there was just a ton of wind that was creating loads of ripples on the lake surface, which was not necessarily the most pleasing. It was quite distracting. And because it was the middle of the afternoon, I thought a long exposure might create a little bit of drama and a bit more interest in the scene. But when you're trying to create a 20 or 30 second exposure with some ND filters, when the wind and the rain is driving towards the lens, you're going to get loads and loads of rain spots all over the sort of front elements, and that's just a bit of a nightmare in post. So hopefully that raw file kind of shows how difficult and challenging that was to shoot. But again, it was worth persevering for because, again, it is a very, very beautiful and a very iconic scene. What made this shot particularly interesting, I suppose, was there was a couple of ducks sat on one of the rocks, and I was praying that they would sit still for 20 seconds whilst the exposure was happening, and thankfully in one of the frames they kind of did. I guess if you don't zoom in too far, you wouldn't necessarily notice any subtle changes. And with this one, the fence is again pointing towards the mountains, and I think it turned out okay. It's not a shot that I would put in the portfolio by any means, but it's a good sort of warm-up shot. And that's what I think these iconic compositions can act as. Often in these locations, there is more than one subject to photograph. And sometimes just going for that iconic shot is a great way to just set up the tripod or, turn on the camera, fire off a few frames, get that sort of dopamine hit that you get of just photographing a beautiful classic composition. Because they're classics for a reason, it's because they are inherently very beautiful. And then just kind of getting those creative juices flowing, firing off a few shots, it just kind of wakes you up and then makes you, I guess, a bit more receptive and aware of what else might be around you worth photographing. So after taking that photo of the lake, that classic composition, I then decided to explore some other elements of that scene. One of the things that I love about that view is the view of the Langdale Pikes in the background. And with the light moving across the scene, it was just creating a lot of contrast. There was, moments where the peak was in light and then the surrounding hills were in shadow. And with the pine trees on the side of the lake, there were moments when they were kind of silhouetted against the glowing mountain in the background. And that's what I focused on for this particular photo. And then walking back to the car, which is only a short walk from this location. You can literally get from the car park to the side of the lake within 5 minutes. But then just walking along the path, there was another view of the lake from a slightly more elevated vantage point. That gave me an opportunity to shoot the lake again with the Langdale Pike. But this again was just a really great vista shot. Again, the light was the thing that was, I guess, really making this scene work for me. It was just waiting for the light to move through the scene and fall on the landscape in a pleasing way where you had nice layers between light and dark, light and shadow. That rhythm throughout the frame was just, again, something that was quite nice in this shot. It's just a great vista, a great view, and, a great view doesn't always make for a great photo, but I think in this case it does. So if you're fairly new to landscape photography, or you're just wanting to explore some of these very traditional compositions where it's quite easy to get a shot that looks good because the subject is just so beautiful or just, very striking, where you can pretty much point a camera anywhere and you'll get a decent photo. I think giving yourself the opportunity to get that photo in the right light, quite literally, is one of the most important things. If you go to these places at times of day that are favourable in terms of the light, whether that's sunset or early in the morning for sunrise, that gives you the best potential of getting something that you're going to be happy with. So luckily there was a composition on the shore of Derwent water where we were staying that was a stone's throw from the campsite. So I visited this location twice. The first time at sunset. So this iconic composition is utilising the canoes and the boats along the shore of Derwent water. You've got the islands in the lake in the background and the fells in the far distance. It's just one of these compositions that is just really pleasing because it's like a jigsaw puzzle. So on this particular evening, it was a waiting game. I stood, in that spot for about 40 minutes whilst the sun was setting just to kind of see what was happening with the sky. And, we got lucky with some really nice detail and some colour in the clouds. This was a photo that, again, it just feels good to get it. It's not necessarily original, but again, it's a really, really quintessentially Lake District photo, I suppose. So on that first evening, it was just a case of scoping it out. And then when I got back to the camper van, I was sort of flicking through and there was just things about it compositionally that I just wasn't necessarily too keen on. I felt like the boats in the kind of foreground, I was too far away or I was too wide. They didn't really have enough visual weight in the frame. I would have liked to have the boats a bit more dominant in the frame. I also found that there was just, I guess, too much room along the lake. There was too much negative space there. And that just came from the tripod being too high. I should have got a little bit lower to make that distance between the boats and the sort of horizon line of the lake just a little bit shallower. So thankfully, with the campsite being a stone's throw away, I came back in the morning and I managed to refine the composition. And I learned a lot from taking the shot the night before. So it's always worth taking that photo, even if you're not necessarily too thrilled with it, just being able to review it, when you're not stood there on the, on the side of a lake with all of the light changing. It's not the best time to reflect on what you're shooting, but reflection is really important. So just reviewing it, being very, very objective and just looking at it with a critical eye, I went back the next morning and I got this photo. Here I feel like I did everything a little bit better. Sure, the conditions weren't quite as good with it being sort of after sunrise, but I felt compositionally this shot was a little bit more balanced. So perseverance is really important. It's important to return to these locations if you can. It's not always possible, obviously, when you're on trips, but again, just reflecting on your work and just seeing what you would improve the next time, I think is a good exercise and a good habit to get into. The final location that I'll talk about is Buttermere and Crummock Water, a really, really beautiful area of the Lake District. Again, slightly more remote, but well worth a visit. Here, it's all about the lake and the lake shore. There's loads of great lone trees and really interesting subjects, and it was great to spend a morning just, exploring this location. The iconic shot in Buttermere is of the lone tree that is on the shore of Buttermere itself. And I saw that tree and the conditions just weren't particularly great for it. The sky was really bright, it was really high contrast, the light was a bit too harsh. I shot it in black and white and I'll put it up on screen so you can see. It's a really interesting subject, the form of the tree is really unique, but there just wasn't really a shot there on that day. So again, I just decided to change tact a little bit, focus on something a bit less obvious. So focusing on Buttermere, it's the same lake, it's the same viewpoint, but there was this old log that was just poking out of the surface of the water. It was right near the shore, so I managed to get my tripod set up and get the camera really, really close to it. And again, I just messed around with a long exposure using a couple of filters, mainly a circular polarizer and an ND filter to slow my shutter speed. And this was shot probably at around 15 seconds or so, just to again smooth out the surface of the water using the polarizer to remove that glare so you can see through the water and make it a little bit darker. I thought that created a bit more of a natural frame for the log, and this shot turned out quite nice. It wasn't the photo that I was expecting to take at Buttermere. I thought I'd be shooting that lone tree. But again, it just shows you the importance when visiting these iconic locations. It's the importance of just being agile and sometimes being able to see things that, are maybe not the obvious compositions while still finding beauty in those subjects. So there we have it, a brief look at some of my favourite locations on my 2-day trip to the Lake District this week. As it is Sunday, I spent this morning actually looking at Airbnbs to head back to that part of the Lake District in a couple of weeks' time because, like I said, the autumn colours were starting to turn and I really want to get back there in that sort of peak autumn season, explore some of the silver birches and some of the woodlands around Borrowdale. There's just so much beauty to be found there, and I really want to make the most of my photography this autumn. So I will be definitely heading back in the coming weeks. So if you want to stick around to come along with me on the next adventure, then consider hitting the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up if you enjoyed the photos. I will leave it there for today, guys. Enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you so much for watching. I always love to hear from you as well, so if you do have any favourite images, or if you've been to the Lake District yourself, let me know your favourite locations down in the comments below. As always, thank you so much for watching. I will see you all next week for another video.